Conflict that took place in the Greater Sydney region, across the Cumberland Plain, along the Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers, and into the Blue Mountains between 1788 and 1817. It's a war about resistance by Aboriginal people to British invasion, written through and reflected in the lens of the invader's own historical archive. As such, I think it's important to acknowledge the people in this book. Those who even Governor King admitted back in 1805 were the real proprietors of the soil. The people who, as I hope my book shows, through their raids, attacks, skirmishes and battles, forced the Europeans into a long war if they were to colonise the Cumberland Plain. So I wish to acknowledge firstly the traditional owners and custodians of the land we're gathered on, and also all the First Nations across what we now call the Sydney region, whose histories of dispossession, resistance and survival I hope this book may add some small further broader understanding of. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who are here tonight, and the elders and community leaders who are here. In particular Shane, I'm not sure if Shane made it tonight, and Gordon Siren, who's here, whose artwork has been so important in changing the ways that we've visualised invasion and challenged its representations. So I've asked a couple of people to say a few words. First, I'd like to ask Philippa McGuinness from New South Press, my publisher, to speak. I can safely say that Philippa and Paul O'Byrne, who's here tonight, their belief in my project really did sustain me in some of the more difficult periods. So thanks, Philippa.
Hello everyone, I am very honoured to be speaking and delighted to be here. Thanks Heather. But before I go any further, I'd like to echo what Stephen said and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet, in the city in which we meet, so across the Cumberland Plain, and pay my respects to elders, any Indigenous people who are here, and elders who are emerging as well. So as Stephen said, this book has been a long time coming. I couldn't remember, to be honest. I could have checked emails or files, but what's the point? I know, I'm surrounded by historians and I could refer to dates, but I won't. But I should also say that for a long time, whenever I saw Stephen at a function like this, he looked a bit guilty and turned the other way. So when the manuscript arrived, even though I sent it back and asked Stephen to do some more work, I really understood why it had taken so long and why it was worth waiting for. It's a really important book, and Stephen has written it with such care and the precision that is absolutely necessary with a work like this, that it made us feel very proud to add it to our list in Australian history. And I've got no doubt that other speakers and all of you who will go on to read the book will really grasp how important it is, and that it does shift the way we think about the early colony. Even, as I happened to be in the botanical gardens after I read Stephen's book and found myself thinking about it in a completely different way. And there are some books that can do that, that can make you see things that you thought you knew about in a different way, but not many. So it's an important contribution to our understanding of very real and devastating conflict and dispossession. And along with my other New South colleagues, Paul O'Byrne, who you mentioned, who's here, and our CEO, Kathy Bale, we are really proud to publish it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Philippa. Now I'd like to ask Professor Heather Goodall to launch the book. Anyone who knows Heather's work will, I'm sure, like me, have been inspired by it. I've been fortunate to have studied at UTS with Heather, we go back a bit, and I've long admired her work in Aboriginal history, environmental and colonial histories, and in particular how these still inform present-day social justice issues. So I'm really pleased to have Heather launch the book.
Well, I'm delighted to be up here, I must say. It's been really exciting to read this book and fantastic to see Stephen produce it and bring it to this wonderful point. And I'm sure that New South Press was just as exactly as pleased as Pip has said, and it's a wonderful outcome for everybody, I think. So obviously this is a book which celebrates the traditional owners. This is about recognising and acknowledging and understanding that traditional owners are the Sydney people. And I think one of the first exciting things about this book was opening up the first few pages and finding the Sydney people, not a language name, not a collective noun, not a dehumanised third person group, but the Sydney people. And I think that was the exciting start to this book for me. Now, for historians, there's been a lot, I think, written about this period of the early colony in the last few years. This book takes us from that early impact from 1770, 1788 through to 1816 in really rich, focused detail. There has been a lot of archival record left for us, but this was a period of enormous misunderstanding and confusion and misreading of what people were seeing, and a failure to appreciate what was going on. So that not only was there that degree of misunderstanding, but there have been very strong motives by the writers of those archives to produce for particular audiences, to tell particular stories. So it invites historians to read between the lines, to look carefully, to read against the grain and all those cliches, and that's what Stephen has really done. But I want to talk a little bit more about how he's done that in a moment, because not only was this any old piece of history, this was a piece which has been central to national mythologies. So it's been gone over with all of the sorts of romanticisation and invested with the sort of myths of nationalism. And so there's a lot to be writing through and teasing out, and Stephen's done that really beautifully. We've had some rich offerings in the last few years from Inge Clendinnen and from Grace Karskens, but it seems to me that this book really does, as Pip has said, this book really changes the way we not only think about those first few years of British invasion, but we think about the country differently. We think about the Sydney people differently. So Stephen has really given us something new, I think, really new again. And I'm sure there are a lot of sources for where this comes from, but I think one of the things that this comes from is Stephen's interest, more than interest, it is his investment and dedication to reenactment. When Stephen first came to the Applied History program at UTS, I didn't understand very much about reenactment and reenactors, and I thought it was a hobby. And I really came to learn, and I've learned so much from Stephen, and I really just, this is one of the many areas in which he's been teaching me over all these years. Reenactment is such an exacting form of historical research. It is such an important way in which we can learn about the past, and I think those qualities really show through in this book, and perhaps, you know, one of the reasons why it is done in such an exacting way. But the ways that I can identify that I think that process of historical research shows through in this book is that reenactment is embodied history. You have to think about your environment. You have to think about the places you might move across. You have to be aware of both the shape, the spaces, the inclines, and the living beings in this more than human world that the human actors are taking part in the past. It's affective history. It's about emotions. It's about the emotional engagement, and you have to think about it because you're a part of that scene. So you're entering into the emotional worlds of those actors in the past. And it's performative because not only are you thinking about the ways these actions were carried out, you have to think about the motivations and the emotions, but you are performing this for an audience. You are telling a story. And I think that extraordinary capacity of bringing together those three dimensions, as well as many others, but certainly those are the three that I'm aware of. I was really aware of that as I was reading this book. Each page made me think about the landscape differently. It made me think about the motives and the engagements differently. I think Stephen's work at the Maritime Museum, which some of you may not know so much about, has really reflected this same capacity for intensive, embodied and engaged historical work. I know Stephen's work from the Canoes exhibition, but then particularly from the Black Armada exhibition, where Stephen was engaged with Indonesians who are in Australia, Chinese Australians and Unionists and others to present a really different way, a number of different ways to understand those events of 1945 and onwards. And then he took it to Indonesia, which I think is just incredibly exciting. It's about engaging with different audiences and new people and thinking about the ways these transnational events had meaning across waters in very different environments. So the work that Stephen's done there in the Maritime, I think, really expands and continues the extraordinary care and insight that he's brought to this work. So this is a really detailed and careful book which looks at Sydney and the Sydney people and that first few decades of the British invasion as a military engagement. He makes us see the landscape as militarised landscape and to see the colony as a militarised colony, as a place of fearful settlement that was not a peaceful place. It was not something with inconsiderable Aboriginal people who were around there who were part of the scenery. It was a militarised space with grave anxieties as well as intense interactions that were occurring in this environment. So the Sydney people had to face that, and they responded with innovative ways, even in those first few years, innovative ways of military responses and human engagement responses, and then they had to deal with the massive impact of the smallpox epidemic and enormous death rates. But after regrouping from that, what the Sydney people were able to do was to innovate and develop quite a clear campaign when Stephen lays it all out with the engagements and the spaces of guerrilla warfare, the sort of guerrilla warfare that we recognise later, centuries later, but we didn't recognise, the British didn't recognise then at that time, but which the Sydney people, Aboriginal people, have been saying all along was what they did. So I think it's an acknowledgement of what has been there in the memories and in the narratives of Sydney people all this time, and this acknowledgement's really important. But the final point I want to make is that if this is military history, it's new military history. There's no accident that, for me anyway, that this is just a few weeks after Anzac Day, when we all had to face that incredible romanticisation and myth-making of slaughtering that occurred in the First and the Second World Wars, and we had to be taken through yet again the ways in which rape is ignored and killing is glorified. Now, this book is a book about military history which takes us beyond the myths, and it takes us to an understanding, I think, of the intense fear and anxiety and mobilisation and courage without the myth-making, without the nationalist myth-making, and without the sexism. This is a book about all of the people who were involved, the Sydney people, the women, the children, the men, and the British, the women, the children, the men, who are involved in this terrible series of wars that have just been written out of the history. And you have to look deeply, and with the sort of embodied understanding that Stephen has brought to it, to find this. So my really final point is that Stephen's a really good writer. So this is very detailed, and it's very new, and it's very challenging history, but it's written really well. So it's engaging to read, and it's absorbing, and it draws you in to the narrative, and it makes you wonder why you hadn't seen this before. And it's because nobody has so carefully brought all the details together and dealt with it with the insight and the emotional commitment that Stephen brings to it. So this is a really wonderful book, and I really commend it to you, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here as part of the launching event.
Wow. Thank you so much, Heather. Now I'd like to ask Gordon Siren to come up and say a few words. Gordon, would you like to? Gordon's achievements are far too many to mention. I think one of his greatest impacts has been a revisualisation of the ways we've been told and the ways we have seen that first fleet of 1788. I know Gordon's work certainly impacted me and played a role in my drive to revisit the written histories of so-called settlement and to rethink them as invasion. It also played a part in my efforts to understand something that I think has been very much missing from the many other histories written about this period: the military nature of the power relations and struggles that always already underpinned moments of contact, encounter and cross-cultural engagement. So Gordon, thank you.
I'm a little bit flabbergasted after all that, such scholars getting up and talking, and I suppose all I can do is tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now I've got to be to art. In 1972, somebody misappropriated a lot of my land, my family's land, and I objected. I went and got a gun and went down, and then to cut a long story short, I went to prison, and I was sentenced to life, and I'd done 10 years. And during that 10 years, before I went to prison, I was an electrician and a few other things. But when I was in prison, I decided I would take up art, and I took up art, and I took up painting. And as you can see from this, in 1788, when the redcoats come through the heads, I suppose I'm a bit of a radical now. They stole my land. You can't hear me. Sorry, Alex. I don't know where I was at now. So, just because I'm not just an angry native or something like that, I also paint sweet little paintings about this cultures and legends. I do about little black fairies on the Waratahs and stuff like that.
Still got the ship.
But I've still got the ships coming through the heads. You have to remember those ships came through the heads in 1788 and took the land, because in 1972 my family had about 3,000 or 4,000 acres of land on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and a fella came along and took it, and I objected, and that's how I finished up in prison. And when I went to prison, it was a hell of an awakening. It was a whole different perspective, and but I'm not going to ever do that again. And so now, today, I paint, and it's so great that I see people like Stephen. We've got to a certain point, and it's a very important point, I think, that Stephen has got to in this book, where I can sort of make a connection. I can't really explain it now. When he was speaking, I could have explained it straight to you, but I can't now because it's so difficult. Because, that book is going to make a difference. I really believe it is, because it made a difference in my thinking. It's like you put a formula up there, and all of a sudden the formula added together, and it makes a difference. Thank you, Stephen.
So, if I can just say a few more words and some thank yous. I wanted to actually draw your attention to a couple of things in the book that are already out of date. And a warning here, just like in many places in the book, there's some graphic descriptions of killings and mutilations. So in May 1788, just 2 months after the colonists arrived, 2 convicts, William Oakey and Samuel Davis, were sent out to cut rushes used in making thatch roofs. There had been a few convicts who had been speared at this point and wounded. Some had gone missing. But the officers were were not sure if they'd just got lost in the bush or been killed. But when they found the bodies of Oakey and Davis, the officers could confirm the deaths at the hands of the warriors in Sydney. It was a gruesome find. Their bodies, their eyes were out, and Oakey's skull had been split open, and there were several spears sticking in both bodies. Now, most historians have assumed as these guys were cutting rushes that it must have occurred at Rushcutters Bay. But several diaries say they were found up the harbour, and in my book I suggest it may have been around White Bay. I was wrong. So the other day at work at the Maritime Museum, I find out we've been donated a logbook from the family of Lieutenant William Bradley, one of the junior officers on the HMS Sirius. Now, the State Library has Bradley's original journal, and many of the maps and charts the officers made when they turned up to Port Jackson. And ship's logs are pretty boring stuff generally. They're often notes of tides and weather and latitude and stuff like that. But in Bradley's log there are some maps and information that didn't make it into his journal or into the later maps that we are familiar with. So I was having a close look at Bradley's first chart of Sydney Harbour, and there's some unusual names he gave to various places, most of them after his fellow officers, and most of them names that weren't used by his captain John Hunter or agreed to by Governor Phillip. And one of the names stuck out, Bloody Point. It's marked on the piece of land jutting out at the end of Iron Cove, where you may know UTS Rowers Club stands today, passed every day by hundreds of joggers on the Bay Run. So this place where 2 creeks join the cove and rushes were likely to have been plentiful is almost certainly, I think, the place where Oakey and Davis were killed. So the events at Bloody Point were also the cause of the first punitive military expedition undertaken in Australia, an expedition that was personally led by Governor Phillip. That's right, Governor Phillip. In fact, it was the first of 3 such expeditions he personally led. The detachment of officers, soldiers and armed convicts, that's right, armed convicts, didn't find any trace of the people who killed Oakey and Davis. But they did stumble across a gathering of over 200 warriors and numbers of women and children. Now, fortunately for the governor of the colony, outnumbered more than 20 to 1, they were allowed to pass and return to the encampment at Sydney Cove. After this, Phillip ordered that no one was to go outside the colonist encampment without being armed or escorted by soldiers. So finding the name Bloody Point is, I think, important in several ways. It reminds us what was in the forefront of the colonists' minds in 1788, the violence and the military threats to their outpost. It also reminds us history is never final, always in the making, and that my book is in no way the final word in these stories. It reminds us that the site of Bloody Point perhaps deserves something more than a rowers club, that this place, like many frontier war sites across the country, has no monuments, no memorials and no broader public memory. Bloody Point also reminds us that the warfare and conflict across the Sydney region was not always one-way traffic. That while there were massacres, there were also victories, such as the battle at Razorback, or in the warfare along the Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers that forced white settlers to flee as refugees from their farms. I hope my book shows people who now live in Sydney that the land, the harbour, the rivers, the Cumberland Plain, the Blue Mountains are all full of sites, hundreds of sites of resistance warfare. The other thing you'll see when you read the book after buying your copy over here, $34.99, from the wonderful people at Dulwich Hill Glebe Books, is that I acknowledge the support of my 104-year-old grandfather, Bill Baldwin. And at the time of publishing, Grandad was eagerly awaiting to see the book, after 4 years or so of making jokes about it never going to be finished. Unfortunately, he passed away a few weeks ago, and so I just want to acknowledge the man who was seriously the funniest bastard I've ever met. I'd like to thank the State Library of New South Wales, in particular Richard Neville, the Mitchell Librarian and Director of Education and Scholarship. The Merriweather Fellowship of the Library was absolutely critical in completing the book. Thanks to the wonderful people here at the Gasoline Pony. Please do stick around and try some of their excellent food and beer. So my friends, family and colleagues who are important to this book are all acknowledged in there. But lastly, I want to make a special thanks to Bo James and Helen Anu. It's been a privilege to learn from and work with these guys who over the last couple of years have really transformed a museum about boats and stuff to one that has saltwater and freshwater stories and people at its core. So thank you very much everyone, and enjoy.
Signing shoot's going to be here now, guys.